Imagine a question so simple, it can dismantle a decade of love in a single breath. That was the moment I found myself in, standing in our sunlit kitchen, the scent of morning coffee suddenly tasting like ash. My wife of 10 years, the woman who had held my hand through job losses and family funerals, looked at me not with love, but with a clinical, detached curiosity. She said the words that would become the funeral dirge for our marriage. "I need to find out," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm, "if big size really matters." The silence that followed wasn't just an absence of sound, it was the sound of a foundation cracking. It was the sound of every "I love you," every shared dream, every quiet morning together, shattering into a million unrecognizable pieces. This wasn't a drunken confession or a heated argument. This was a calculated decision. She had been thinking about this, researching it in her mind, and had now arrived at her conclusion. I was no longer her husband, I was a variable in an experiment. I was the before picture. For a week, I moved through our home like a ghost. I'd look at our wedding photos and see not the joy in her eyes, but the unanswered question lurking behind it. I'd replay our intimate moments, not with passion, but with a cold, analytical horror. Had every sigh been genuine, or had it been a performance? Had every moment of closeness been tinged with her silent, scientific inquiry? The trust, the very bedrock of our relationship, had been vaporized. The man I thought I was, a good husband, a loving partner, felt like a fiction she had politely tolerated while she waited for the main event. I realized then that I couldn't fight this. I couldn't compete with a phantom, with a hypothetical better that existed only in theory. To beg her to stay would be to validate her question. It would be admitting that my value was tied to a physical measurement, and that was a game I refused to play. The most powerful, and the most devastating, decision I could make was to simply get out of the way. So, I sat down with her one last time. There were no tears from me, not anymore. There was just a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. I told her, "You're right. You absolutely need to find out. And I won't stand in your way. But you won't find out while you're married to me." I saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes, then a hint of panic. I think she expected a fight, a negotiation. She didn't expect me to call her bluff and raise her. I filed for divorce. It was the quietest, most soul-wrenching transaction of my life. We divided our possessions, our friends, our memories. And I set her free, into the wild, to conduct her research. The first few months were a blur of gray. I moved into a small, empty apartment that echoed the emptiness inside me. I focused on work, on rebuilding myself brick by brick. It was a slow, painful process. I had to learn how to be me without the us. Meanwhile, through the tangled grapevine of mutual acquaintances, I'd hear things. She was dating, a lot. She was exploring the world she was so curious about. I'd hear whispers, and I'd just nod. It was no longer my business. I was a scientist who had left the lab. Then, about a year later, the message came. It was late on a Tuesday night. A simple, "Hey, can we talk?" My first instinct was to delete it, to maintain the clean break. But a part of me, the part that needed its own closure, was curious. We met at a neutral cafe, the air thick with unspoken history. She looked different. Tired. The confident curiosity she had worn a year ago was gone, replaced by a weary sadness. She didn't waste time. "I was wrong," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I found out." She told me about the parade of men, the experiences she thought she needed. She described a landscape of empty encounters, of physicality without soul, of intensity that faded as quickly as it flared, leaving behind nothing but a cold loneliness. "It turns out," she said, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, "size doesn't matter. But connection does. Respect does. Safety does. Knowing someone's heart does." She had gone looking for a simple answer to a complex question, and in her journey, she had discovered she'd been asking the wrong question all along. She had traded a deep, resonant connection for a series of loud, meaningless noises, and the silence that followed was deafening. She had gotten her data, her proof, but the lab report was a verdict on her own mistake. I listened to it all. I absorbed her regret, her pain, her belated understanding. And in that moment, I felt the final piece of my own heart heal. Not with vengeance, but with pity. I had already grieved for the woman I thought she was. The woman sitting before me was a stranger, one who had learned a brutal lesson too late. I paid for our coffees and stood up. I looked at her, this architect of our mutual ruin, and I felt nothing but a quiet, solid peace. "I'm glad you found your answer," I said. And I meant it. Her search for a physical truth had led her to a spiritual one, and in the process, it had led me to my own freedom. I walked out of that cafe and back into my life, a life I had built for myself, on my own terms. The experiment was over. And I was finally, unquestionably, the result.